a dear friend, a global expert on real estate economics. Richard holds the Lusk Chair in Real Estate and is professor at the University of Southern California in the Public Policy and the School of Business. He was also at the George Washington University School of Business and Wisconsin-Madison before that. What makes Richard unique is also the fact that he's one of the few economists in the area who's worked closely with the government within the US, advising housing policies and real estate policies. So he's going to present evidence and what we know about housing development. Are some problems intractable? Basically, it's of relevance to India today because Housing for All is one of the largest flagship programs of the Prime Minister today. We've had a series of reforms in the urbanization space, and yet affordable housing remains a key constraint. And with the growth, the massive growth in urbanization that we are seeing in the country today, it is likely to remain a significant concern for the coming few decades. So it's a good time to make a concerted effort, learn from the global experiences, from experts such as Richard, to see if we can bring in some of this knowledge and actively push it into our own affordable housing policy in India. I think given the federal nature of the country and housing being a lot of policies regarding housing being a state subject, including land, there is a lot to learn from countries which are very different from us because several states in India are experimenting with urbanization policies, real estate policies. So I think there is something to learn at the state level as well. We have the best discussant for Richard on this, Dr. Samir Sharma. He's an IS officer of the 85 batch from Andhra Pradesh cadre. He's currently the DG and CEO of Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs. It's the institution of the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. He was also the additional secretary spearheading the smart cities mission of the government for the last 4 years. So Samir is the right person to speak about the government initiatives and where we can take some of the lessons from Richard forward in India. So Richard, you have the floor for 45 minutes, and then Samir will do a discussion for another 15 minutes after that. Please, come on.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think I'm going to start by making you feel bad and then making you feel good. So the bad part, I'm going to ask you the question, how many of you think India is successful at housing its people? Okay, I kind of knew what that answer was going to be, so that's the bad part. Okay, how many of you think that there is a country in the world that does a really great job at housing all of its people? Okay, which country? Germany? Not even Germany.
China.
Not China yet. China's come a long way, but no. Austria's not I have to check on, okay, maybe I'll add Austria. I hadn't thought about it. Yeah? No, Canada has issues. It's very expensive in Vancouver. Yeah, if you're a normal worker in Vancouver, there's no place you can afford to live. Any other, so I've come up with one, but now Austria may be two.
Sweden.
And it's not Sweden, but you're really close. Norway, okay. All right, Norway, so far as I can tell, houses everybody in a place they can afford that's reasonably close to a job, that gives access to good schools to their kids, Sort of, the whole, I'm sure you can find a stray person in Norway somewhere who has a housing issue, but no, they do a wonderful job of housing everybody in Norway. Okay, what are some facts about Norway? It has about 5 million people. Its per capita GDP is higher than that of the US, and its Gini coefficient is 0.27. So it's a rich country that has income equality. So if you can get yourself to be a rich country with income equality, you're probably going to get rid of your housing problem. Unless, and I'm not counting places like Liechtenstein and Monaco and that kind of stuff. I mean, it has to be sort of a real country, but is 5 million even a real country? It's about the size of the city I live in, Los Angeles, half the size of Los Angeles County, a third the size of the Los Angeles metropolitan area, and we won't even begin to compare it to Indian cities. So that's why I start to wonder, that's why I use the word intractable. This is not a uniquely Indian problem. This is a problem that is faced nearly everywhere. I mean, how we would characterize it would be different in different countries. But I would say we in the US have a housing problem. We have lots and lots of people who are either spending half their income on housing, which we think is too much, or are taking 2 hours one way to get to work, which we think is too long. So the quality of our stuff is not quite as good as we used to think it was either. So this is a worldwide problem. And so I'm hoping that I can provide some ideas for ways forward, but the intractability issue, I think, is very much a function of how much income do you have and how evenly is it distributed. I think if the US had a Gini coefficient that Norway has, we wouldn't have housing problems. I'm pretty sure I'm right about that. Okay, so overview of the talk. What do we know about the land underneath housing is what I'm going to start with. What do we know about building housing and who should build it? What do we know about owning housing? Should we think more about renting it? That's a rhetorical question. The answer is yes, we should. And one way, again, India is not unique is its emphasis on ownership vis-a-vis renting, when renting is a really good way for lots of people to consume housing. What do we know about financing it? And finally, from a development standpoint, how much should we worry about it? And believe it or not, that question is not quite as rhetorical as the fourth question. Okay, so what do we know about land development? Well, I think when you think about land development, you need to think about what is successful land development. It's development that integrates housing and infrastructure. So to me, a house is not walls and a roof and a toilet and a cook stove. A house is something that's connected to economic activity, connected to health, connected to transport, etc. When I teach introductory real estate, the first thing I say is real estate without connectivity is dirt. And so you need to think about how do you integrate land development and infrastructure. And there are places that have worked quite well. I know you're sick of one of them. Every time I go to a country and mention one of them, they say, yeah, but they're not like us. It's not the first. Hong Kong, people seem to be eager about Hong Kong. When you talk about Singapore, they say, yeah, it's the Lee family business, and it really doesn't have anything to do with us. But I think there's still a lot we can learn from Singapore. And one of the things we need to remember about Hong Kong and Singapore is in the 1960s, they were poor places. Per capita GDP in Singapore in 1965 was $300 per head. So it's not like they started out with a lot, except for an amazing advantage in terms of their location and the benefits of boycotts of China, which meant cities that could be transshipment centers became, Hong Kong and Singapore being the example, could become quite valuable. But they didn't blow it. They made a lot of good decisions. China, and then a mystery country that I'll come back to. And then I want to talk a little bit about places that have not done a good job of attaching housing to infrastructure. One next door, Bangladesh, and the other, Brazil. Brazil is probably the more relevant case for you. So, why are Hong Kong, Singapore, and Shanghai successful? They use proceeds from land sales, or Singapore is different, property taxes and pension funds to finance infrastructure. So in Hong Kong and Shanghai, it's just very direct. The government releases land, developers bid for the land, they bid through an auction process, it's a transparent auction process. We know that when governments are trying to raise revenue, there is nothing that beats an auction. When we moved from sort of doing bespoke contracts for resource extraction and changed to auction, suddenly governments got way more revenue as a result. Same's true with the broadcast spectrum. And the other thing is it allows you to say, okay, if you don't meet a reservation price with the auction, which is, in the case of a city, enough to put in the infrastructure necessary to build the extra housing without it burdening the city, then it's not time to lease the land. So it can be very informative. So you know, what does it cost to put in sewer, water, electricity, roads, metros, schools, etc. And if the bidding process doesn't produce enough to pay for all that, then you don't do it. But very often the bidding process produces a substantial surplus because of the nature of auctions. So it ensures that infrastructure projects have a funding source and are positive NPV projects. To me, one of the most remarkable institutions in the world is the Hong Kong MRT. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's their metro system. It makes money. It's a metro system that makes money. It's, I think, the only one in the world that makes money. Has anyone ever ridden on the MRT? Okay. Is it expensive?
Yeah, it's very expensive.
No. I mean, compared to Delhi, it's expensive. That's true, where it's 20 rupees to ride the metro here, which is really ridiculously inexpensive. It's about like a third the price of riding the New York City subway system. It's cheap by world standards. But the key is it's a land developer. And it basically does the land development and then auctions off leaseholds to people to put buildings on top of it. And again, if the leaseholds don't generate the revenue necessary for them to put in all this infrastructure, they don't do it, and they operate as a business at a profit. I think the other reason they're very successful is, and this is a pointed point in India, is they don't fear high floor area ratios, or FSIs as they're called here. They know it leads to efficient land use. So the typical FSI in Hong Kong is about 8. In Shanghai is about 6. Compare that to here. I guess the one place I just learned the other day that Hyderabad has no ceiling on its FSI, but of course Hyderabad has infinite land in every direction, so it doesn't matter that it has an infinite ceiling on its FSI. And they also have recognition that low-income households need access to jobs, and so they have very large subsidy schemes, not so much in Shanghai. But in Hong Kong, half the people get some sort of housing subsidy. I'll come back to that. And 80% of people in Singapore get a housing subsidy. Now, the form of that subsidy is a little unusual, and what happens is the government holds the land underneath condominium projects, and then people pay for the condominium. And so they're basically paying for the construction cost plus a little bit of profit, and not the land. But then when they resell, there is a governor on how much appreciation that they're allowed to get. And that is 80% of the residential market in Singapore. Because, well, we'll see in a few minutes, it otherwise wouldn't work. But the revenue they generate, in Singapore's cases with property taxes and the National Provident Fund, is sufficient, which doesn't have anything to do with real estate, but they just decided this was important, was sufficient to make sure that everybody in Singapore who's a citizen of Singapore can get access to this housing. Okay. On the issue of density, one of the things that puzzles me about Mumbai's famously low FSI is, and I remember talking to officials in Mumbai 12, 13 years ago, and them talking about how morally unhealthy it was for people to live in tall buildings. And so density was an issue. Well, I'm sure you all know this. The problem is, so here is, I'm going to learn how to do this. There we go. Here is Singapore. Here is Hong Kong. And here is Mumbai. And you see the purple and orange sort of in there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send it to the next graph. Here's Mumbai. And here's Hong Kong. Okay, Hong Kong has, orange is the highest amount of density. So just so you know, you can't read the legend. But Hong Kong is really, really dense. Right? See all that orange? The reason there's no orange at the top of the island is because that's commercial buildings. But Mumbai is, it doesn't matter that there aren't the buildings, the density is there. You got to put people somewhere. And so it's really striking. I'll just come back. I'm going to go backwards. Whoops. This is what that density looks like in Hong Kong. Kind of nice. Within there, there's a lot of units that have subsidies mixed in. And then, of course, this is what Mumbai looks like. And as many people there as there are here, and maybe building up wouldn't be such a bad idea. Okay. So I think one of the things about Singapore, Hong Kong, and China is they've embraced urbanity. There is no shame in being urban. And I think one of the most damaging people in history was Thomas Jefferson. He had his, there was, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. I like that. He did a really good job with that. We have a really nice founding document. I commend it to you if you never read it. But he also had an aversion to cities. And this is a famous quote of his. I think our governments will remain virtuous for many centuries so long as they're chiefly agricultural. And this will be as long as there shall be vacant lands in any part of America. When they get piled upon each other in large cities as in Europe, they will become as corrupt as in Europe. And I think this attitude is not a uniquely American attitude. I think this has spilled over to many countries around the world. There's something virtuous about being a farmer, and there's something sinful about being an urban dweller. When in fact, if you think about like living standards and safety, if like you worry about worker safety, farm is like one of the worst things you could do if you care about people. I mean, I know we need people to farm, but and so Jefferson's bête noire, Alexander Hamilton, who, among other things, had a great musical written about him. There was actually a musical that was kind of about Jefferson too, called 1776. It was nowhere near as good. But Hamilton saw America as a place of cities and established finance and was particularly important. And so, I don't know how you change attitudes, but if you don't embrace urbanity, you're going to have bad urbanity. Okay, so people are reasonably fearful of having more buildings near them because they live in an environment where they say, look, our traffic is bad, our air quality is bad. We see all the negative externalities arising from how crowded we already are. And they're not wrong about that. So what you need to do is say, okay, how do we make it so that we can have more people housed here and we don't make life worse for you? Now, you don't want to lie to people, so the transition is painful. Hong Kong in the 50s went through a painful transition. Shanghai in the 90s went through a painful transition because basically to redevelop, you have to push people out for a while. The thing Hong Kong did that was quite remarkable in the 50s, and I still marvel that they did it, is they said to people, look, you got to go away for a while. You have to leave your slum because they're dangerous. And there were fires regularly in Hong Kong that were killing people. There was one particular one called the Chap Chai Mop fire that killed something like 1,500, 2,000 people in a short period of time. But here's what we're going to do is in 2 years when you come back, there's going to be a flat for you and you can live with all your neighbors nearby in your flat. We're going to basically recreate the neighborhood where you lived before in formalized housing with appropriate infrastructure. And they actually kept the promise. And that to me was a remarkable phenomenon. Now there's been problems with that public housing, and I don't want to sound Panglossian, but it really is a striking example of how you can put people through pain for a short period and leave them better off as a result, so long as you keep your promises. So we need to think about how do we put in this infrastructure, and so value capture, which is something that Hong Kong has done brilliantly. MMRDA is now doing it and is in the auction business, and I love that. There are basically three ways to do value capture. There's negotiation. You sort of do bespoke deals. That's how we do it in Los Angeles. It works terribly. Don't do that. It basically allows for corruption. In LA, it's not illegal corruption, it's legal corruption, which is we have these things called campaign contributions. And so city council people say, yeah, I'll think about giving you more density. Hey, I'm thinking about it. Oh, you want to contribute to my political campaign? Yeah, okay. The words are never spoken, but They don't need to be spoken. And then there's the possibility of illegal corruption, of course. Impact fees, I think the problem with impact fees is they're rigid. So you say, if you have this many square feet, you have to pay. So let's say and again, we have a fee like this in Los Angeles. If you build an apartment building, you have to pay $17 a square foot in impact fees for that, to build that floor space, okay? Well, what's the problem with that? On the one hand, there are contexts where that's going to be too much and you're not going to get the housing. And there are other contexts where, if you're a government, again, you want to maximize revenue to put in infrastructure. And it may be that it's so valuable to develop there that if you had a market mechanism, you could extract more. And so what you want to do is identify what is the amount of money that you can get from the developer in an idealized sense. And auctions do this. So Hong Kong has done this brilliantly, again, with releasing land, basically. Again, MMRDA is in the auction business, but again, that's land release, 80-year leases. The key is the reservation bid. Revenue should be sufficient to build the necessary infrastructure, and if it's not, you wait. So it's also a signal of where do you develop next. Okay, but I want to suggest that this be done beyond land. Think about what zoning is. It limits a property right. So essentially, if you're a developer in Mumbai or Los Angeles, for that matter, because we are not zoned sufficiently densely given demand pressures. If you just give people FSI, what are you doing? You're giving them a windfall. You're making a transfer to people who have done nothing to earn the transfer. I think one of the problems this country, do we have any developers in the room? So one of the problems this country has, along with my country, is we have developers who are among the richest people in the country. Now, I think it's fine for developers to make a nice living. They do a useful thing. It's a hard thing. It's a complicated thing. So if you're really good at organizing and building stuff people like and minimizing costs, should you be compensated? Absolutely. Should a real estate developer be as rich as someone who's invented Google? I don't think so, okay? But how does this happen? It's because developers have traditionally gotten windfalls from governments. And it's not that the governments go around saying we want to give you a windfall. It hasn't occurred to them that they're doing it. So we need to have them pay for the release of air rights, basically. How much? What should they pay? Well, you could find out by auctioning air rights. And this is something that, again, 40, 50 years ago, the technology would have made this very difficult. We can do this now. We auction everything now. And you don't even need to own the property to buy the air rights. You get the air rights and you sell them to somebody else, that's totally fine. But I think that's the mechanism going forward to move from lower density to higher density zoning. Okay. The other way to do value capture that I'm a big fan of is ad valorem property taxes. And again, I know they're here in India, but they're not used very much. One of our most successful places economically in the US, and one of the places that's done the best job housing people in the US, is a state called Texas. There are ways I don't particularly care for Texas, but I look around and they're better housed than pretty much any other successful economic place in the US. Okay. You look at, there are cities where housing is cheap, but people don't have income, so that's not good. This is a place where people have income and the housing is inexpensive. What do? Well, they finance pretty much everything with ad valorem property taxes. And they're stiff. They're about 4% a year, 4% of the value of the property a year is what you pay in Texas, but it's the only tax, it's basically the only tax you pay. And that's enough to fund schools, to fund roads, to fund sewers, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing about property taxes as opposed to the upfront fees is, one, land taxes are economically efficient because land is not footloose. Right? If you tax a factory, they might say when it depreciates, I'm going to move somewhere else. With land, you can't do that. And the other thing is they lend themselves well to municipal bond finance. So If you have a sewer that's going to be around for 100 years, the people who are alive right now shouldn't have to pay for the whole thing. One of the things that annoys me is when people say, oh, we're making our children pay for that. Well, there are things we shouldn't make them pay for, that's true. But if a sewer system is going to be around 100 years from now, sure, they should pay part of the cost of that. I should pay a third, the kids should pay a third, the grandkids should pay a third, something like that. Maybe it's 25, 25, and 25, and 25 for the four generations. How do you match up that cost, that capital cost over generations? The property tax is a really nice way of doing that. The other thing about property taxes is they're transparent. In many countries, you can see what your neighbors pay in property taxes to make sure that they are paying on the same basis that you are. The downside is they're slightly regressive, but it turns out only slightly, and there are ways you could read it. I have a broader view about tax policy, which is that if you want to redistribute, don't do it through the tax code. Do it through the social welfare safety net. But that's another talk. Okay. But coming back to Hong Kong and Singapore, for all of their successes, and they are very successful, they have a problem. So if we look at monthly average income in Hong Kong, for example, it's about 2,500 euros a month. If we look at the cost of a one-bedroom apartment, it's 1,600 euros a month. If we look at Singapore, it's not quite as bad. The monthly average is 2,800. The apartment is 1,500. But in Hong Kong, you're spending, if you don't get a subsidy, this is the key. If you don't get a subsidy, you're spending 2/3 of your income on a one-bedroom apartment, if you're the typical person. In Singapore, you're spending half. Milan, pretty successful city, also spending half. New York, half. And this comes to the more general issue. Cities that are economically desirable places to live are expensive. And that's why we need to think about subsidy. And again, Singapore and Hong Kong, at least, they do a good job of that, although Hong Kong is really straining that 2/3 cost is, even as rich a place as Hong Kong is, it's just too much for them to provide everybody a subsidy that needs it. So we need to think about this, even in places that have done well. I'm going to come back to that. Why are some other places less successful? Difficulty in funding infrastructure, particularly if capital markets don't like you. So there's a place like Bangladesh, which basically is detached from capital markets. How on earth do you get this stuff financed in the first place? Again, the hostility to building upward, I've already talked about that. Lack of technical expertise in subdivision. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. When I did work in Bangladesh, it was really stunning to me, because this was the first poor country I worked in roughly 17, 18 years ago, that every house was a one-off. Every house was built as an individual economic process. There was no manufacturing process to building housing in Bangladesh. As it is, the most efficient manufacturing processes for building housing worldwide are still not particularly efficient. If you look at agricultural productivity since World War II worldwide, it's up about 700%. If you look at construction productivity, it's up like 6%. So it's not like we've done that great anyway, but there are places around the world that don't even take advantage of sort of the manufacturing aspect of subdivision. Lack of expertise in contracting, to make sure that the guy doesn't run away with your money that you're paying to hammer boards together or pour concrete or something like that. One thing that we see, it's here, it's in Brazil, it's in South Africa, it's in Mexico, I've seen it in a lot of countries, is you'll have multiple government entities owning tracts of land, and they can't agree among themselves what to do with it. So it sits lying fallow for long periods of time. And then the political economy of changing regulation, and this is sort of my snarky comment before, of course, developers love regulation. They complain about it, but how have developers gotten rich in India? They don't have competition. And so their margins are amazing. I'll return to Texas. Margins in Texas are really thin because there are a zillion developers there. You make it on volume. I mean, they make money. They make it on volume. but they don't make it on particular developments. Okay, so I've already shown you the picture. I mean, it's just striking to me, given that the densities are essentially identical in these two places, the residential densities. And this is a new, by the way, this is not, I wasn't like trying to game it. This is a brand new picture of Mumbai. I just found it on the web yesterday. And it's the photographer named, oh, I should have credited it on here. It'll come back to me. I wrote to him for permission to use it because I think it's such a beautiful picture. So that's this year. You know, if that were a park space, well, even if it were park space, look, it's just very inefficient use of land. Okay, mystery country. And this is going to be something a little different as I've been talking density, but of course there are a lot of people who live in places that aren't all that dense, even in India, and we need to figure out how to provide them housing too. So this is a country that in 1950 had per capita GNI that was comparable to South Africa's today, so we'd call it a middle-income country right now. The reason I picked South Africa is I looked at the GNI of this country, and I looked at the country closest to it in a moment, and it's South Africa. In 1940, only half the housing units had indoor toilets. It developed an entrepreneurial, technically adept industry that manufactured housing while built on site. Repetition of floor plans led to building efficiencies. And of course, I'm talking about the US here. This is Levittown, built outside of New York City after World War II. People call it banal, I suppose it is. But a couple of things about it. First of all, it delivered housing more cheaply than it had ever been delivered before. So these houses sold for about $4,800 each. If you would inflation-adjusted terms, that's about 50,000 US dollars right now. So what is that? Like 3.5 million rupees, if I have it, 35 lakh, is that right? Rupees? To build one of these houses, they had no frills to them. They didn't have garages. They had carports. They were adaptable. They were built on a manufactured process. But the other thing that happened that was unique from the standpoint of infrastructure provision is while the city would send out the trunk infrastructure, so the sewer line, the road, et cetera, all the internal infrastructure was done paid for by the developer and then deeded back over to the city. So it's not privately owned underneath, but it's privately built. And again, unless the developer put in the infrastructure, they were not permitted to do it, which meant that there was a discipline on the developer to do it cheaply and well, so that they could make a profit. For sort of more exurban areas or for smaller cities, this is a reasonable solution. You probably want more density, the houses closer together, maybe you want 2 units, 4 units, but the point is there are efficiencies to this sort of technique that could be taken advantage of in parts of the world where it's not yet. Okay, who should build it? And so Shimika, I started 10 minutes late. I still have my 45, right? Okay, all right. So one thing I don't like is governments building housing. I like governments redistributing money. I worked in the Obama administration, so I'm an American liberal. But governments have had a history of doing a bad job of building housing. And in particular, they tend to build it, they spend too much money on it. Again, in the US, when you build something called affordable housing, it costs about 30% more than the private market stuff to build. And that's because the length of time and the bureaucratic processes it has to go through layers cost on cost, and so that's just crazy. Even if they have the capacity, will they know what and where to build? And we see evidence of this with houses resold for less than construction costs when governments build them. And I'm going to give a number of examples of poor practices. I think the ugliest block of housing I've ever seen is outside of Krakow in a place called Nowa Huta. This is a picture of it. This doesn't do justice at all to how really ugly it is, because this actually, it kind of looks okay. It is sort of the worst kind of Soviet architecture in really bad condition. And its value now, and Krakow is a beautiful city. with a beautiful medieval center square. It's a very desirable place to live. When when housing was privatized in Poland and people were given their flats in Nowa Huta, they couldn't give them away. I literally mean that. So people just walked away. So this stuff has really fallen down now. Moscow. Moscow has one of the most interesting density profiles in the world. My friend Alain Berthaud has a famous map of residential population density in Moscow from 20 years ago. It's basically even throughout the city. So imagine a city where the density on the periphery is exactly the same as the density in the center. How does that happen? It's central planning determines where everybody goes. And of course, the apparatchiks lived in the center of town and everybody else lived on the periphery. And what we're seeing is this remarkable phenomenon. We've seen this remarkable phenomenon since the early 90s in Moscow, is the stuff in the middle is getting recapitalized. People are putting a lot of money into it. And the stuff on the periphery is falling down. So cities have patterns for a reason. There's a reason why they're dense in the center and less dense on the periphery. And so even though there's this capital stock in Moscow, where it shouldn't have gone, it's falling down, and where it should have been, it's becoming more valuable. U.S. public housing. This is a place called Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. How many of you have heard of Pruitt-Igoe? I'm just curious. It's sort of a notorious. It was built in 1955 at a cost of about $20 million US, which was real money at the time. It was torn down in 1968. It was so badly built and so badly managed that within 6 or 7 years, nobody wanted to live there. It bred crime. People felt disrespected in it. And this area now, it sort of became so toxic, it's still, there are no buildings there. And by that, I don't mean that there's a park there. I mean, there are weeds there. It's quite remarkable. It not only, and this was actually a neighborhood, you could sort of see the neighborhood fabric around it. There was a real neighborhood there. They weren't the greatest houses, but they were houses. There were local grocery stores, schools, churches, etc. Putting this in the middle of that neighborhood basically destroyed the neighborhood. And our experience in the US was to do this over and over and over again until we stopped doing it. South Africa and Brazil, very similar kinds of housing policies, and it says how it's important to give government officials the right incentives. So in Brazil, there is a program called Minha Casa Minha Vida, which promises everybody a house in Brazil, a nice house, sort of a 60 square meter house that's connected to sewer and water and electricity and so on. And officials in Brazil were given the task of building as many of these units as quickly as possible, and they did it. They built something like 3 million houses in 10 years, which was great. Except, if your only objective is to build units, what are you going to do? You're going to try to build them as quickly and cheaply as possible. And how do you do that? You build them on the periphery. They're peri-peri. They're not just peri-urban. They're peri-peri-urban, other than the fact that they have services. And the thing about Brazilian cities, and particularly Sao Paulo, which is the largest and most important economic city, is the jobs are very concentrated in the center of those cities. So if you put people on the periphery, they're 2-3 hours away. And so what's happened in Brazil, in the Sao Paulo context, is people are taking their units and renting them out at very low rental rates, rents that couldn't possibly justify the construction cost, and then moving back into the favela in the middle of town near their jobs. In South Africa, they haven't overcome one of the most important problems they have, which is apartheid. Now, apartheid has been gone since the days of Nelson Mandela in name, but again, as Alain Berthaud points out, if you look at zoning codes in the major South African cities until a few years ago, they were identical to what they were during the time of apartheid, with the exception of the fact that the word apartheid was removed from the zoning code. But a feature of apartheid was low density in the center of cities and high density on the periphery, which is what has led South African cities to become dysfunctional economic places, right? It's the opposite of what it should be. So when South Africa's government decided to build people houses, they didn't change the zoning and build houses in the middle of cities, Johannesburg, Cape Town, etc. They built houses in Gauteng province, way outside of the economic activity, long walks from bus transportation. So again, what would happen is people would be given houses that had a construction cost in the neighborhood of $8,000–9,000 US, so very reasonable, and they'd sell them for $4,000, and then move back into a slum near their job. Okay, well, I can promise you it is not sustainable to have a program where you're building something that costs $8,000 and the market says is worth $4,000. That just doesn't work. And so governments really have a hard time deciding where to place housing. And I don't think it's so much because of lack of knowledge, although that may be part of it. A lot of it is because of the way incentives are set up. So why is this pernicious? People wind up with unsatisfactory dwelling arrangements. They're in the wrong location. They trade off with other goods. So they would rather have a smaller house and have more of other stuff, but they're sort of stuck where they are. Scarce subsidy funds get wasted. And to me, there's overwhelming evidence that subsidies to individuals go further than subsidies to building. And I think there are people who think there's an ideological component to this, but every time I've looked at this, and my friend Steve Malpezzi and I have done quite a lot of work on this, if you give people a voucher, of every dollar you give them, about 85 cents actually goes to the intended recipient. So there's leakage of 15%. And then because the vouchers allow people to move to the places they want to move, you get positive externalities. You really do. So in the end, sort of the benefit cost is one-to-one. So you redistribute, which is a desirable outcome in itself, but you basically get all your money back. When you look at production programs, the recovery rate of subsidies is between 35 and 65%. So you're basically throwing away money. And that's why it's not an ideological phenomenon, it's an empirical phenomenon. These sorts of programs just work better. The problem is somehow people don't mind when governments build buildings, but they mind when you hand money over to other people. Maybe not in this society, but a variety of others. But okay. I've really talked about this. Okay, what about owning? Okay, first of all, property rights. How important are property rights? Well, they're not a panacea, and I think we've finally gotten to a point where we understand that. I felt like I was fighting Hernando de Soto for 10 years. Because, I mean, you know, the mystery of capital, you unlock wealth. Well, of course, property rights fail to have meaning if actors have no confidence in legal institutions. So you tell me what good you feel about your court system, and I'll tell you how good you feel about property rights. Illiterate people are in a poor position to defend their contract rights or even acquire them. The Peruvian experiment with farmers was a failure. That was De Soto's own country because they did not have title for years. They had just had families farm the land for years. They would get title. Some Sharpie from Lima would come down and say, hey, see that piece of paper? I'll give you $500 US for it. And they would say, wow, that's a lot of money. Sure, it's just a piece of paper. What do I know? And then, of course, they would come and take over the farm. They would take the farm away from the farmer, who really had pretty good security of tenure. Yes, could they mortgage the property? No, which is what De Soto wanted them to do, to basically tap into that capital stock. But at least they had security of tenure. And beyond that, you know, if you don't fix infrastructure, property rights don't matter very much either. If people are sick, they're hard pressed to be productive even if they control property. So I like to think we've moved on to understanding that property rights, formalized title is not a panacea. It's a good thing. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm saying it's not all that. Okay, so now that said, formal development, and one of the things we could have a conversation about afterwards is informal versus informal, and I've been talking almost entirely about formal development today, can only take place when there's confidence in title. And when I did work in Krakow about 22 years ago, one of the things that was striking is you would have two lots across the street from each other, same neighborhood, vacant, services, the whole bit, and one would sell for 10 times what the other would. And it was entirely about, was the title in dispute or not? So when there was a clear chain of title, basically what happened is the communists figured out who owned the property before the Nazis came in. And sometimes that was easy to figure out. And if it was easy to figure out, you had property value. If it wasn't clear, if you had 15 people claiming title, it was worth nothing. Okay, so, and of course, capital markets will not participate in markets where they lack confidence in legal institutions. And we talk a lot about credit market and legal risk when we talk about capital markets, but political risk really matters too. And one of my favorite examples of this is South Korea, which is a country that does very well, that has very good institutions, but it's very hard to issue debt with more than a 5-year maturity date in South Korea. Why? It's North Korea. Is the investors fear that South Korea may not be here, and so they're only willing to give it 5 years, and they even consider that a bit of a risk. You know, the idea that South Korea is going to be here in 20 years is too big of a risk for investors to take. So you can only get short-term debt in South Korea as a result of that. Okay, so I'm running out of running out of time. I do want to make sure I talk about rental. Leasehold property rights is a two-way street, okay? It must be the case that landlords have their freehold interest left over from leases protected. So you think about the landlord as a fee simple interest. He sells some of it with a leasehold. There's something left over. You need to protect what's left over, or else people will not be landlords. But at the same time, the benefit to the tenant must be enforced with equal diligence. Without that, it's hard to have a good rental market. And people will say things like, Italy is great and Spain is great because they have an 80% ownership rate. And the reason they have an 80% ownership rate is they have dysfunctional rental markets. And the reason they have dysfunctional rental markets is you do not have fair enforcement of leases in those countries. And by fair, I just mean that you do what the lease says that the lease does. Okay. Credibility of contracts, including defining property rights, depends on agents having a sense of fairness, and this can be a challenge. So in Bangladesh, where literacy is defined as the ability to sign one's name, this is a problem. In Mississippi, all kinds of shenanigans have been used to take property away from African Americans over the years. And we had predatory lending recently in the US. So some regulatory environment so that people feel like they're treating fairly when they're in a contractual arrangement is also important. And then finally, and sanitation and property rights interact. I think I have like 3 minutes. So let me just finish with a plea for rental. Housing policy in emerging countries focuses on ownership. We had the pleasure of meeting with the Minister of Housing the other day, and he talked about the 4 verticals with owner-occupied housing, and it sounded great. And I asked him about rental housing, and he said after the election. And I have a feeling if I came back in 5 years, and I'd have a housing minister, and he'd talk about the 4 verticals on owner housing, and I'd say rental housing, and he'd say after the election. I think part of it is there's a prejudice against landlords. David Ricardo didn't like landlords, and so he has an influence. And let's face it, some landlords behave really badly. The way we deal with landlords making too much rent is we tax their land. But it's an important piece of the puzzle. UN Habitat endorses the importance of rent. From a cash flow affordability standpoint, think about in India, how much less pressure there is on cash flow if you're a renter than you are with an owner, right? Renter yields are 2-3%. That means it's cheaper from a, now again, it doesn't mean it's a better investment, but it does mean when you're short of cash flow, it could be a better solution. It allows people to reserve savings for other kinds of investments. Maybe I don't want to put money in real estate. Maybe I want to put money in a small business in India. Maybe I have a tech firm in Bangalore I want to fund. It's an investment opportunity for the emerging middle class. If I build a 2-unit building, I live in 1 unit and rent out the other. It can help me pay for the side I live in and provide housing for someone else. It's an information benchmark. It helps us know whether we have bubbles in the market or not, because when rents and prices get out of whack with each other, that tells us a lot. And it makes labor mobility easier because when you don't have a commitment to a house, you don't have to sell a house. If you have to leave from one city to another, it makes it easy. So we need to think more about developing robust rental markets, and not just in India, but other countries around the world. And I'm out of time, so I'm not going to talk about finance. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thanks, Tushar. I have 10 minutes, right? Okay. 3-4 minutes on how we have reached this condition we have, and then what did we do in 2014-15, the way forward in 2014-15, now what we plan to do. In between, there are a lot of intersections with what he has said. I'll try to sort of explicate those. See, if you cannot understand housing in India unless you go back, say, 200-300 years. When the British came, you know what they did? They built a few towns which were really the places where they could export stuff outside. So you had Chennai, Bombay, Calcutta, and then later on Delhi. Then they built a few satellite towns to ensure aggregation of products and also distribution of consumer products. This is the spatial pattern of cities. Inside the cities, what they did, they built 3 or 4 types of lines. Lines because they were grid pattern, straight roads. You had the military lines, cantonments. You had the civil lines. You had the railway lines. Rest of the city, they just didn't bother. It grew on its own. It just grew on its own as it could. So when we became independent in 1947, in fact, housing was the most important thing in the first plan. Urban development was subsumed in housing. In the social head of account, urban was developed, urban was subsumed. There was no urban development. It was subsumed in housing. And housing was highly subsidized in the 50s, but in 60s they found that they were running out of money. And anyway, the private sector was putting nearly 10 times the money what government was putting. So the first phase we could say in the 50s and say up to nearly end of 60s. 60s was the time of great disruption, you know, a lot of things happening. So we had this concept of public sector driven housing, highly subsidized, not only housing, land and infrastructure. 2 particular sets of people like BD workers, then, you know, dock workers and all this. Then they found in 60 that it wasn't working. So they went into this idea of self-help housing, and you had HUDCO being formed, HDFC, all this stuff. So they could start lending to people to start building. This continued up to 70s and 80s. Then it opened up around, it started in the 80s and then really opened in the 90s. The private sector was brought in, and we had all these different schemes going on. And that was the real commercial phase. The commercial banks could start lend to housing only in 2000. They couldn't lend before that. And earlier to that, only a few housing finance companies were lending. So this is what happened. And we had these schemes going on, and government was trying, you know, to somehow address this housing problem. So what happened at this point now? What is the housing situation in India? There are roughly anything from there are roughly anything from 1 million to 1.5 million plus is the housing demand. And we have around 10 million to 15 million housing demand. And 10 million houses in India are vacant today. Of course, they don't match. The people are looking for houses and the houses vacant are different. I mean, they really cannot go and live in those houses. But you have a country where there are 10 million houses which are vacant, and you have 10 to 15 million people looking for houses. And we have had all these schemes where it was public sector driven initially, then it was self-help driven, where they were given loans, the government housing boards, housing corporations, they started building for the people. And then you had largely the private sector and commercial led. Surprisingly, in a large number of countries after World War II, they went in first for rental housing and then for their own individual housing. In India, rental housing never found a place throughout. I mean, that way you're absolutely right. It was never even thought of. And that's part of it is cultural. You know, we want to own a land, we want to have our own house, we want to have a separate house. It's a cultural issue.
We say that in America too.
Okay, yes, the Levittown, yeah, absolutely. So now in 2014, they looked at, the government looked around, they said we should have a bouquet of housing. So the housing for India then is largely a matter of retrofitting. If you assume there are 15 million housing demand, 75% of the housing demand is not that they don't have a house. They are living in congested conditions. So it's a matter of housing poverty. It's congestion, it's overcrowding. Because they kept on building on the same plot of land, small. On the other side, what we did, we had this master planning. In 1949, there was a master plan, this building code in Britain, and we made a model law on this, and we asked all the states to do it. Now, then we had this master plan. Master plan was cast in stone, but it could never sort of keep pace with the fast changing economy of the cities and the need for housing and infrastructure. So what happened? Severe violations. Now violations one way helped the builders, but here there are a lot of individual violations. So what happened? Starting 1990s, government started giving the exemptions. You allowed one more floor, you allowed excess building in your plot coverage, and finally they said where and as and where it is, whatever is built is regularized. It was largely the master plan which completely controlled building activity, but people were compelled to violate. And if you look at this ceiling in Delhi, this is a classic example of a master plan completely outdated with the existing situation, and now they are saying you implement the master plan, so they're sealing everything. But in the states, they were smarter because they had a government, so they passed a law regularizing everything. Except in a few states, they went to High Court like Himachal, and High Court said no. So as Ananya Roy of University of Southern California says, it's impossible to plan. And how do you plan in this? Tell me, if this is what is given to you in 2014, what do you do? It's largely an issue of retrofitting now. So in order to have retrofitting, we had this scheme of housing for all, in which there were 4 verticals. One was, if you are living someplace and you want to upgrade your house, you do it to ameliorate the overcrowding and the congestion. Second was, if you are living on any private land and that private person negotiates with the developer and they build 1/3 for selling to outside, 2/3 can be built as good housing for these people. The third was government lands, you give it to them and 35% is built for the poor. So you have, this sort of a cross subsidization which went on. So these sort of arrangements with public-private partnership were envisaged. Now another thing, government-led planning for houses, what happened? The houses were typically built away from livelihoods. They were built where land was there. It was not built for people. So there were, as you say, numbers, and they had to be built. In Hyderabad, when I was municipal commissioner, we built some 60,000 houses. And it was this much subsidy given, this much houses built. That was in the JNURM housing. And so, there was severe market-induced displacement also of these people, because they could sell the house again, go back to where they were staying. And the changing nature of housing is now, earlier the people who used to come from outside would stay on public lands. In fact, 50% of these people who are slums now are on public lands. 40% is on municipal lands and rest is railways, very little on defense and state government lands. So earlier they used to come and start staying here. Now, largely they are staying in the peri-urban areas, the suburbs. All the density concentration is happening there. In fact, the density is reducing in the core areas and cities. It's actually amazing what's happening now. So this is the situation. It's absolutely unique. I mean, I did a doctorate in metropolitan development in US. I couldn't find a theory which I could use when we were making policies. So we picked up several theories, picked up bits in this, and this is what came out. And this time, let's hope there was a lot of retrofitting in it. There's development and there's redevelopment. So these 3 parts have been combined into the housing mission. But imagine if in the 50s we had started off with rental, we had given rental vouchers. Even now, rental was proposed, but the issue with rental is linked to a law. There's a Rent Control Act still in operation in some places. So this led to very perverse consequences. If you take my house on rent, I'll take some 100 times the rent upfront. So if you don't leave the house and pay me some 1% of the capex also doesn't make a difference. Cannot Place. I mean, you look at the rents in Cannot Place, and you're amazed. Or even Khan Market. I mean, look at the capital value and look at the rental value. It should typically be something 7, 8%, 10%. It's less than 1% even. Yeah. So, this sort of things is sort of bequeathed to us, and we have to, and it's a political economy. I mean, it's not easy to get these laws out because there are a lot of political groups who compete against one another for the decision of the political and bureaucracy. So, this is what I want to tell you, and it's an amazing situation. I mean, we've been trying to wrestle with it for a long, long time, and at least now what we have done, we have tried to reduce this over congestion. We have tried to link livelihoods with your place of stay, so your school's education, your place of work, your transportation is sort of taken care of, and this is what is happening at this point. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have some time for Q&A. If I may, Samir, based on Richard's presentation of the international experience and your comments, one is, what is the status of the greenfield urban projects in terms of, is all of it retrofitting, or are we seeing in some parts of the country developments really of the greenfield nature? That's number one. And number two, what is happening with the rental policy? Are we thinking of coming up with a comprehensive rental policy in the country? We'll start with that, and then we'll go to Richard.
Shamika, this, you see, greenfield is one of the verticals which is permitted, and government is actually promoting more of greenfield. It doesn't really promote retrofitting. That just comes on its own, people who want to do it. But greenfield, in fact, one of the major thrusts of government is that we have a lot of lands in the public sector, like HMT, BHEL, right in the center of cities. So why don't we take away that land and use it for housing? So that greenfield plus greenfield on the peripheries, because peripheries are going. Rental policy, there was a group of secretaries which had recommended that there should be rental vouchers. So now there are three things going on. One is the Rent Control Act. I mean, have a rental policy which, as Richard was saying, you have a sort of a equal relationship between the tenant and the landowner. And they were thinking of having a voucher scheme, a scheme to give vouchers to the poor so that they could sort of rent the houses wherever they want, which would be a partial rental payment, naturally not the full rent. Right. Yeah, thank you.
Great. So now if I can request you to introduce yourself quickly if you have a question, and let us know who are you referring to. So could we start with this gentleman here, please?
Okay. No, this is a question to you, sir. So you very quickly mentioned on the greenfield housing and things like that. So we've been hearing this for 20 years, that this excess land, public sector, it will be released. And at least in most cities, we've not seen anything. In Mumbai, we've seen some development on these NTCs and these textile land, etc. In Delhi, only thing that we have seen in recent times is these Kidwai Nagar redevelopments, etc. But vast pools of land in many other cities, railway land, this, that. I mean, nothing much has happened, and nothing much has happened on the land pooling policy either. I'm sure the beginnings have been made, but why does it take so long? I mean,
I would just say the political economy. To negotiate to get a land of a sick HMT unit takes years, because the question is what do you do with it? How do you give it to a builder? In a situation where you make a decision and there may be an inquiry against you after 4 years. So unless there's an absolutely foolproof system of disposing of the land, they're not willing to dispose of. HMT is not willing to give. So what did government do? It's a very smart move. They started giving this to NBCC. You know.
They will muck it up. Just like DDA mucked it up at one point in time.
So, yeah. So, so this was a middle way to get over this problem. But even the NTC land which you say, there are at least 3 or 4 CBI inquiries going on in that. So it's a matter of political economy. That's it. Otherwise nothing. And that's why decision making is so slow. There'll be at least 7-8 people who will sit down and decide. No one person going to decide this. Among those 7-8 also, each will think, they'll think, it's like this, what is the risk for me? I'll retire after 4 years. If there's a case, I'll have to run around. So why? See, there is no punishment for not deciding. You get it? I mean, you're not punished if you don't decide to sell the land. But if you sell the land, there's a risk. So it's just a matter of risk calculation in the political economy.
What about auctioning of the kind that he suggested, as an option, the way we dealt with the coal mines eventually?
The auctioning any land resource, or even if you look at the airwaves or the coal mines, if maximization of money is, it's fine. But then what happens, the people who require housing, they may not get it. Sure. The rates will be very high. I mean, especially if you take up central Delhi or if suppose this Kidwai Nagar you auction, I mean, you'll get crores. But then, they may not build. Unless you put a condition like we have that 35% should be for the poor.
Can I respond to that? So this is what they do in Hong Kong is they use that money to give subsidies to people. I mean, it raises, the key thing, and I didn't emphasize this enough, is make sure that the money raised through the auction stays with the property in a sense. And one of it is putting in the trunk infrastructure that's necessary. But the other thing is so people are not displaced. You just basically, and again, my preference is you give them cash transfers that allows them to compete in that housing market. And then let the builder build whatever she wants to build. But, and yeah, it may be expensive housing, but if you turn around and give that surplus to poor people, and in Hong Kong it's middle class people, so that they can go and compete in the housing market, I think it leads to a virtuous cycle if you do that.
Just take the use of
This is Neeraj, I'm from KPMG. And the connected point to that is also, the fact that if you look at the Kidwai Nagar, the way the developments happened, the kind of density that we are having over there is abysmal, from a city center perspective in that. So we had an opportunity, when we had also worked earlier with Ajay Makan, on few things around it. But finally, what's the output which has come out is an output which is fairly low, from the, in terms of quality standards, like what Richard also was mentioning. The government, when it goes into housing or say related development, the quality, the efficiency, and also the efficiency of usage of land. Center of the city, we've got low buildings currently here. While we can cite seismic and various things around it, but the fact is that the technology change is not happening. We are not adopting to better standards, and what that leading is that suburbs are becoming taller and taller. While in the compact city concept, you would have had the core of the city getting to be much larger around it there. So somewhere efficient use of land, which is always limited in supply, somewhere the policies are not encouraging efficient use of land, and finally we have got this fact that the prices also increase and availability is very low in that sense there.
So did you have a specific question in mind?
Yeah, so I was asking the point to say that why is it that when there is such kind of a opportunity which is available, we end up using not applying a fresh brush to it and having better norms from an efficiency usage point of view there.
I would say two things. One is when you retrofit, it becomes such a challenge retrofitting the infrastructure. As Kidwai Nagar, now Jal Board is saying we don't have water even for this. So all others have stopped now. When you retrofit everything. And when you retrofit, it's so difficult to model. If we are going to put 20 stories next to Ames, what will be the increase in traffic, not only in this junction, maybe 10 junctions away? We just don't know the effects. You see, the metabolism of a city, it's so difficult to predict. So that is one. The other part is about this core city. See, even in the US, this core city was abandoned in 70s, 80s. All the theories went away. They are now polycentric cities. So India, truthfully, is now developing as a polycentric city pattern. You get it? It's not that everybody has to come to Delhi now.
What exactly do you mean by polycentric, if you could just...
Yeah, see, see what happened, like look at Delhi, I mean these major cities with British developed, so there's a Connaught Place and there was this NDMC Luton's area. So large number of people used to come here and go away because there was nothing else. Now what's happened in the US also, if you look at any of the cities, Detroit and all this, they had a core and there were a lot of manufacturing plants, they used to come there and go away. And that's where, then in the 60s, all these, they called the white flight, they all went to the suburbs. And the suburbs developed. But somewhere in the late 70s, 80s, they started seeing polycentric. There's a monocentric, where everything comes and goes from here. In late 70s, 80s, they started getting these polycentric cities. So you had the famous book of edge cities, you know, where you had these edge cities coming up. So these edge cities themselves have a small core and they sort of live on their own. So like Gurgaon. Now Gurgaon, I don't have data, but not so many people come to Delhi and go that way. Maybe our road network is skewed, that's different. So they are developing polycentric cities. Same now in Delhi. Now if you are living in Nehru Place and you hardly come to Connaught Place, you will not even come for 6 months. You see, for anything. So this is what, it's a polycentric city which is developing on this existing city. And now there's an existing FSI based on the master plan. To impose another FSI in small pockets in the city, it is impossible to plan for it. Now if we have these 7 small pockets in the fringe of NDMC area, I mean, you just don't know what's going to happen. Water, sewerage, of course electricity may not be such a major issue, then roads.
Oh, you have it. He has the mic.
I'm Sudeep from OP Jindal Global University. Actually, my interest is mainly in finance. You know, since this financial crisis, I mean, there have been many big economists like Robert Shiller and others in the United States mainly, who have worked on this kind of interaction between capital markets and housing market, and mainly kind of suggesting some new kind of financial products like convertible bonds and so on, which can reduce or mitigate risk. So how do you see that this kind of financial products are developing in developed economies as well as in developing economies like ours? Do we have any?
So one of my favorite lines about innovation in finance is from Paul Volcker. And he said the last innovation in finance that did anyone any good was the invention of the ATM machine. I mean, so things like convertible bonds are fine. So basically, they convert to equity when people are upside down on their houses. But at the end of the day, I think it's about having lending contracts where everybody's interests are aligned. And so the two things I learned from the crisis on finance are, first of all, underwriting matters a lot. And it matters more than like the size of the down payment people make. Is really understanding, documenting their income, documenting their savings, which I know is a challenge in a place like India, really matters. The most successful loan product through the crisis in the US was the VA program. I don't know if you're familiar with this. This is a subsidized program that gives mortgages to veterans. It had the lowest default rate of any mortgage type. The down payment on a VA loan is 0. Because it's a veterans program. But it turns out what they do is they make sure, because they don't want to be foreclosing on veterans, that they really make sure that veterans can pay their loans back. The other thing that I found amazing is how unwilling people are to default on mortgages. So a lot of the crisis we had involved investors getting loans that they shouldn't have gotten. And that's 2 categories. One sort of general speculators, and the other is, in fact, I remember it was 2005, I was in a taxi in Atlanta, and the taxi cab driver told me that he had 9 mortgages, 9 houses. And I said, how's your cash flow? And he said, oh, it's fine because I have this loan with this really low interest rate. And I said, well, what happens when it goes up? And he says, oh, it'll be fine, I can refinance it at that point. So, But if you look at owner occupants, they basically did not default unless they lost their job. Las Vegas saw house prices fall 65%. They had defaults of about 20%, which is very high, but you ask yourself, why isn't it 40, 50, 60%? Still people with no equity in their houses. So again, underwriting, making sure people are living there, making sure they have a job, making sure they can document their savings so that if the furnace goes or something like that, they can fix it. That stuff seems way more important to me than trying to come up with exotic financial products. And on the new construction side, making sure developers pay the money back before they take any profit out is a really important thing to make sure that those incentives are aligned properly. And if somebody else wants to talk more about that, I can do that too.
Okay, we'll come to you.
My name is Dr. Sharma. Housing, I believe, is a concurrent subject in India. As per 2011 census, they have mapped about 248 million households. Now, what happens is that majority of rural and peri-urban households are not registered. I mean, there's no legal records for that. So how really, are we going to really legalize the household, the majority of households which are in rural areas and peri-urban areas to be considered as legal houses? Or the registered houses, I suppose.
Several states have several schemes of giving titles. They call it sometimes registration titles. Sometimes they give them temporary titles so that they can get a loan and build their houses. There are homestead acts. If you've been staying there for 10 years, it's your homestead. So they do give you a title. It's called in different ways in different states like pattas, etc. Yeah. So they have these schemes, and as you rightly says, largely in the peri-urban and rural areas. And but I'll just add to what Richard was saying. I mean, he's right. One of the main reasons we are unable to get loans is, first is the paying capacity of the poor for 10 years. The average size of a house, the average price of a house which a poor person can comfortably afford is 4 to 6 lakhs. Is 4 to 6 lakhs. Ideally below 4 lakhs. Because if you take the annual income, 1/3 is the maximum you should use for the EMIs. Now in this range, getting a house is a big challenge for, even for the builder or anybody. So actually, if you look at it, a lot of our loans, they have said you can give from 0 to 20 lakhs. So large part of loans are going for 16-20 lakh cost of houses. So this is a very big challenge. And one reason you can't have a documented flow of income for 10 years, and then the title, as you rightly said.
Majority of houses are built on agricultural land, and the conversion by the states is a big.
But that in the JNUR there was a reform that if you're building a house, there's automatic conversion. A lot of places to get over this. A lot of states have done that. Automatic conversion, agriculture to housing, not industry, but housing.
Okay, perhaps the last question from you.
Thank you very much. My name is Sagar. I have a multiple cabs, and I do a lot of business and other activities. And my question to you, Mr. Richard, because we see in Delhi also, in Shanghai and other New York and other cities, there is a multiple development. Let's say the universities, the industry, a lot of activities, the power center, and then that city becomes choked. Now, is there any plan for smart city, green city around the world where verticals are given no to anything? Because then there will be all civic problems. So is there any smart cities or green cities where we can live in mansions with less transportation, on bicycle, on some better, so that our children, if you are in a vertical place, where would you go after having a dinner or a lunch? You have to move around. Your children have to move around. You can't sit in the vertical, occupancy. But in a case if you have a mansion, you can walk around, once you walk to this building, you find that you are breathing a nice air. But if you go to a building opposite to, the other side, you'll find that it's difficult to breathe. So my question is, how far in the world, anywhere in the world, we are looking for green cities with mansions and breathing facilities, and the civic facilities on its own can take care of it? Thank you, sir.
So that's a very deep question. And I'm going to respond to it in two ways. So first of all, two of my favorite cities in the world to walk in are New York and Hong Kong. I find it refreshing to walk in both of them. In fact, I had business on Wall Street every now and then for a while, and I would have meet a friend for dinner on the Upper West Side, and I would, at the end of my business day on Wall Street, I would walk up to dinner. That's a 3-mile walk, because I enjoyed it so much. It was so entertaining. And so I don't know that I agree with your characterization that if you're in a vertical city, you can't enjoy a nice walk before or after dinner, because I've had many nice walks. And in Hong Kong, what you want is for it to rain, because otherwise it's too hot. But it's the sights, the sounds, the smells, the architecture, the whole thing. I love all of it. But maybe that's just me, and maybe I'm just weird. But more seriously, I think that there's an area of economic conflict here that I don't know how to solve, and it's an important one. We have two kinds of workers in the world increasingly, and I'm not talking about in the ag sector. We have knowledge workers and non-knowledge workers. We know knowledge workers need to cluster to be productive. Enrico Moretti, who's a professor at Berkeley, whose work I admire a lot, just did a paper where he showed that if you took all the software engineers in the Bay Area, San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and distributed them around the US, they would lose 15% of their productivity. So they live close to each other for a reason, which is they're more productive people. They get more done by being in that cluster. Okay, Mumbai has got to be a cluster. Bangalore has got to be a cluster. Delhi, and so you sort of have this, what I call black hole, that just draws people in together. And so against that, you're right, it is, why do I live in Los Angeles? I spend far more money on a smaller house in Los Angeles than I would spend on a much bigger house in Salt Lake City, Utah. Salt Lake City is would be an example of your garden city. It's a beautiful city set in the mountains. Everybody lives in a single family home. Yes, the air is, you could take walks and so on. Why don't I live in Salt Lake City? Because I would miss the intellectual interaction that I have where I live in Los Angeles. I would miss being able to have the variety of consumer goods I have in Los Angeles. And by that I actually don't mean stuff, because I can get that on Amazon now. I mean like walking into a bar and listening to music, and the musician is really good. And so there's a reason cities cluster, and they're powerful forces. And the comment about people moving out of center cities, the interesting phenomenon that's happened in the US since the 90s is they're actually coming back in to the middle of cities, but it's the knowledge workers that are doing that. And what I can imagine is there's a world in which knowledge workers are going to all cluster together in these big cities, and people who are not knowledge workers may very well live on houses by themselves on large lots and use technology in order to work. They don't really need to be that close together. But I think we're a ways away from doing that. But we need to overcome that productivity problem to get to the world you're talking about.
Wonderful. I think on that note, we really do have to end. You have a question, but we'll take it over coffee perhaps. Huh? Thank you all for your time. This was a fascinating. I learned from both of you. I'm sure the rest of you did too. Thank you for coming.